Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. Really pleased to be with you, and it's nice to have a threesome this time.
And Robert Klinck from Canada, the eastern side of Canada. Welcome, Robert.
Good to be with you, Arnie. I had a very pleasant time in Australia, largely thanks to you and Beata. So
Hmm.
it's good to be in touch again.
No worries. We were pleased to receive you too, Robert. It was a great visit and a good result. Now, in Australia, we've just recently had an election, and the Conservative government has been returned. And I find it fascinating because there were certain elements within the Conservative government who I would describe as liberal or socialist or inclined to be even collectivist, Marxists. And the fact is that even though the Conservative government has been returned, I don't believe that the answers lay within the government, but I believe that the answers lay within active individuals pursuing correct policy. And so I'm going to open the floor for discussion, and we'll work it through one at a time. So, Wally, could you lead from the front?
Well, I would say that in spite of a long period of history and going back and forth from conservative to what we would call more left governments, we have to admit that the growth of government has just kept on growing without cessation. It has been growing and growing and growing. Taxes have been going up, governments are becoming more intrusive, and the supposed objective of the conservative movement is gradually being eroded. There must be something wrong. Somebody must be doing something that is not effective, or they must have a wrong orientation to policy, or they must be doing something that is not, it's certainly not effective.
Thank you, Wally. And your thoughts, Robert?
Well, people get their hopes up when conservative governments are elected that some sort of responsibility is going to be introduced into budgets. Now, we have a different concept of budgets because we think that they are a restraint on development that they shouldn't be. But if you look at history, practically every conservative government that's been elected that pretends to be fiscally responsible actually ends up expanding debt in the country more even than liberal or socialist parties have done before. This was true of Ronald Reagan. It was true of George Bush Jr. It was true. Now it's proving true of Donald Trump, running fantastic deficits.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, we have to look at some different approach to policy if we're going to change the direction we're going in.
It's both interesting comments in regard to the, if you like, the hopes and aspirations, and I agree that the aspirations in a conservative government are ill-founded. Now, I'll remind our viewers, in 1975, a conservative government was elected under the leadership of Malcolm Fraser, and he was taught in the same schools as the Fabianist Bob Hawke. He was taught in the same schools. In fact, as I understand it, a godchild between the two was actually, they were so close. And I find that fascinating because that was an absolute disaster conservative government. And fact is, we've probably had 40 years of disaster conservative governments on and off in Australia. And I don't see that the collectivisation, the imposition of Marxist dogma, or the brainwashing of our children has actually changed one iota. In actual fact, it's continuing on, especially through the chairs in the universities and the seminaries. And of course, when the leaders are trained in this philosophy, then it outworks through the positions of leadership in society and in industry. And I find it that the program hasn't skipped a beat. It hasn't missed a beat. Now, with the likes of Donald Trump, has he actually provided the fiscal policy, the fiscal responsibility? Has he actually reduced the actual intrusion of government into society? And I don't believe that he has at all. And so really what it is a continuation of exactly the same program under either Liberal or Socialist or Conservative governments, whatever you want to call them. Wally.
Well, Donald Trump, during his short period, the debt has continued to go up and to go up quite drastically. And that would seem to be contrary to conservative policy as they perceive it or conceive it. And yes, absolutely. He has now, apparently, the Canadian and American governments have apparently now come together and decided that they were going to cancel some of these restrictions that they'd been put on aluminum and steel, I believe it was, because they're finding that it's having negative effects. It's having negative effects on certain sectors of the American economy, and they're complaining. And so it's what it does. It contracts trade because you're making trade more expensive, and it puts the price of things up at home because you've got these tariffs that are in place. So it's a completely wrong idea, and the wrongness of the idea is that the problem exists in production rather than in consumption. The problem, there's a bottleneck in consumption, and that is the problem, which nobody perceives, apparently, or they're ideologically or religiously inclined not to want to see it because they don't want to make consumption more easy. They have some kind of a quite mistaken notion in their mind that that we're living in a state of scarcity. And we are living in a state of financial scarcity. That's why we're having to borrow like mad continuously in order to live today by drawing on the future. But we're certainly not in a condition of physical scarcity. We're in a condition of physical abundance, and it could be a lot greater if it weren't for the artificial restrictions that are placed on consumption, because production will respond to consumption.
That's a very, very important observation, Wally, and especially in regard to fiscal or financial, economic environment. My concern is certainly weighted in that area, but it's also weighted towards the cultural environment, and that is the imposition, if you like, when you impose such a horrendous debt on our students, on our potential home owners, then what they can't do is they can't even take a breath for a second. They are on the treadmill and it will never, ever let them go. Your thoughts, Robert?
Well, that last comment is very interesting to me because our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has encouraged illegal immigration into our country. And we have the National Police Force waiting at the border to receive these people who fly over from Africa into the United States. It doesn't look as if they're that hard up somehow. And they walk across the border and they are received with open arms. And thereafter, the government assumes responsibility for them. And they provide them with housing. They provide them with free medical care, free dental care. They provide them with, I don't know, as a family, I guess, $50,000 in order to establish themselves. They provide cell phones. They provide education. The university here in Hull is just overflowing with, obviously, recent immigrants here. And I look at what the government does for native-born Canadians, young people, and they all have to earn this stuff. And they go to university and they come up with a massive education debt that is going to hang over their lives forever. So it's so anomalous that a Canadian government is not doing for existing Canadian citizens anything like what it's doing for new arrivals. It's a scandal.
It is a scandal. I agree, Robert, and it's to me it's no different in Australia. The government, the previous Conservative government, was hiding the actual immigration numbers and saying that it was as low as 150,000, whereas the real numbers were over 260,000, with a projection that it was going to continue on at that level. Now that's a significant city of new people, new arrivals to Australia every single year. And I know in America it's over the million number a year. The thing is that that may produce a shot in the arm for the economy of building houses to keep these people in, but it's not actually resolving the escalating problem of homelessness in America in the instance, but certainly in Australia of the lack of home ownership, which is being moved away from our young people, the level of debt that they're incurring through education and home ownership, and of course with the deconstruction of the of significant branches of Australian industry. This is all part of a program, all brought about under Conservative governments. And so it's to me it's absurd to turn around and say, well, is there a hope? Is there a hope? Is there an opportunity that we're going to have with Conservative government over a blatant socialist government or liberal? You call it liberal, and I see that it's to me it's no different. So put it back, Wally. Your go.
Well, the left is concerned primarily, allegedly, with labor, work. That is their key area of focus. Quite frankly, the Conservatives also are concerned with work. They want jobs, they want to sell, they want more production, and they are both puritanical in their approach. There is no room for universal inheritance in the policies that are emanating from either of these quarters, which really leads you to the conclusion that the same policy is being worked out, regardless of which alleged ideological group is in office. There is no difference, basically. It is work, sales, more development. There is no really desire for a cultured, civilized, human civilization. It is a commercialized attitude toward life. It is the same, well, even Christmas. Christmas is a big commercial event. Sell, sell, sell. Do you really talk much about the principles of Christianity at Christmas time? The idea of giving, maybe, but that doesn't apply to the economy in general at all. And so I really feel that there is, we have been brought through dialectical use of language, the use of language to confuse the meaning of words, to be drawn into the support of a common policy of employment, of work, of full employment. Work, taxes, and death. It's a very bleak and a very materialistic approach to life. And it's surely, because in the days of Mary England, we've discussed this before, we're told that they had actually 150 or so holidays a year. And the people only had to work for a few weeks to provide their basic needs, which obviously were less than we would consider them to be today. But the thing of it is, they were able to provide what they had for themselves, whereas today we can't provide unless we go increasingly and terribly into debt.
That's the very, very important point, Wally. Robert.
Well, Wally was mentioning the use of terminology in a cultural war, and today human beings, people, are regarded as human resources. They're regarded as workers, and this is apparently the highest status that they can attain. I would like to remind people that back in Tsarist days in Russia, the people who were working on the big estates were identified as souls. And I think that we would do well maybe to identify people in our society as souls, and we'd give them more respect and have more civilized policies toward them than we did.
I think that's a profound observation, Robert, that that we are so focused on the economy, we're so focused on financial debt that we forget the purpose of life. And yes, Wally, the 150 days, 150 holy days, 150
Well,
days where you didn't have to turn to work. And yet, all my children, um, I was working for most of my working career under a 35, if not a 40, 42-hour week. My children put in 60 hours, and they don't earn anywhere near the income that I did. And of course, with the price of housing, a block of land would take you a year or so to pay off, and then a house maybe 5 years on top of that. Whereas nowadays, a block of land is at least 5 years worth of actually punishing saving to even get your block of land. And that's how far out of reach all these things are. This is the outworking of policy. This is the policy being a pursuit of an objective. And of course, the indebtedness that is there is a form of control. We talked about, I think the other week, we talked about the dialectics of how you have one side arguing with the other, but the end objective, being the left or the right, is always revolution. And in this instance, the end objective is indebtedness and, if you like, enslavement. So to me, the objectives of both conservative or liberal, socialist, whatever parties is enslavement. It's control over the masses rather than emancipation, rather than freedom, so that they have the opportunity to pursue the goals that they want in their life. Wally.
yes, Arnie, control is the key aspect of the policy that's being implemented. It may sound a bit dramatic to say so, but I think we're in the age of the soul snatchers. They're trying to steal our souls.
Mm.
They're trying to steal our souls by making it impossible for us to be concerned about anything other than the treadmill upon which we are in order to satisfy or to pay off the debts that we've incurred when we have no chance of doing it anyway, because the economy can only function on further debts and expanding debts.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is something quite malevolent going on here, really. Mm-hmm. And to what extent it is due to conscious policy or combined with foolishness or innocence or ignorance, I'm maybe not prepared to say at this moment, but it is certainly consequent to some very undesirable attitudes about human beings, the purpose of humanity, the purpose of the individual as an individual, not as a collective, but as an individual. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to control, if control is your objective, and it is, because if we look at the debt that's being built up, who owns that debt? Do you own it? Do I own it? That debt is highly concentrated. If the banks have created all of our money, because banks are the only source of our money, and it's done through their creation of credit, which acts as money, and leaves a trail of debt. That debt is the instrument by which we're kept on the treadmill. Surely, to goodness, we have something of a higher nature in which to engage than to be kept in this state of, the Marxist idea. They do not believe in a deity or any supreme being or anything beyond the material. To them, we are simply protoplasm in motion. That's what we are. There's no need for a soul, because a soul is just an imaginary thing. To them, I don't think there is such a thing as a soul. We're just here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I yesterday I was working in the paddock, and I managed to put a small drill bit well into my finger, I think all the way into the bone. And the interesting part about it was, okay, there's a bit of blood and guts and all that, but the interesting part about it is that in the design of my body, the actual cells went into immediate healing. One was to stop the small amount of blood that was coming out. The other is to actually introduce the macrophages and whatever the other white blood cells, red blood cells, to heal, but then to rebuild the skin, the tissue, the damaged parts of my finger in a fashion that is similar to the original design. Now, you turn around and you look at a bridge you look at any sort of man-made construction, and you put a rocket up it and damage it, and it does not have the capacity to self-replicate, to actually bring it
No.
back to order. And here it is. This is the nature of my body and every single body that's out there. Its nature is to actually find equilibrium and to heal and to restore it back to order. I see our cultural demise, and that's how I describe it. The influence of Marxism or dialectical materialism or Illuminism or Satanism or whatever pagan other religion that's out there is a direct assault on the body politic, the body culture. And it's up to the body culture now, individuals, in my view, to do something about it. I've changed our direction, and that is that I believe it comes back to the individual being a type of white blood cell, a type of healing power into the actual situation of our culture, of where this is going, because we've observed what's happening. We're making considerations based on history, based on what we know to be truth, and on the basis of that, we've got to consider, well, what can we actually do about it? And I put it to you that it's up to, you can't trust Donald Trump. You can't trust Morrison or Theresa May or Trudeau. You can't trust the individual. The fact is they're corrupted because of their position. So it comes back to exerting sufficient political will over the situation in order to bring about healing and in order to bring about or restore to right order. Your thoughts, Robert?
Well, with regard to healing, in the last political campaign in the UK, there were Conservative candidates who were saying that the Conservative Party was going to organize a period of creative destruction, which is a purely Marxist goal. You know, it's absolutely Marxist. So when you look at these conservative parties, you see the face of them, but you don't see the advisors who are operating in the background. And these people are often revolutionaries. You know, Richard Nixon was elected, and everybody thought there was going to be a great conservative revival. And what did he say? He said, "We're all Keynesians now." John Maynard Keynes was a Fabian socialist.
Mm-hmm.
He developed financial policies to transfer power to the international banking fraternity.
Mm-hmm. So we've seen the outworking of that, of course, because the world indebtedness to the international banking fraternity has got to the point where it's more than 3 years complete production. 3 years complete production of the entire world is how much is owed to these central banks. And these central banks are really only a handful of people. A handful of people. 3 years complete production of the entire world is now owed in the form of numbers. So you've got to consider that the financial system as policy was there to impose debt. And as far as imposing debt goes, it's been very successful. But the fact is that in the, if you like, the Christian culture, there is a time of forgiveness of debt. We pray it. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. We pray it every single day. Our parliaments pray it. And yet they won't actually look at bringing about or restoring correct order in this area of finance. And of course, how can you render unto God the things that are God's when there is nothing left after you've given to Caesar? There's nothing left. You are so heavily taxed, so indebted, so enslaved to the system that there is no opportunity to render unto God the things that are God. So to me, this is a profound consideration in that. And if ever there was a time where Christianity has an answer for an ailing world, it is right now. Wally Klinck.
That's right, Arnie. You were talking about an organic approach to our problems. Excuse me. We have practical problems, and Christianity bears upon those practical problems. People have to understand that it is not just not just an artificial or imaginary sort of thing. It applies to the real world.
Mm.
And unless we can apply the principles that are embodied within Christianity or just realism, we cannot succeed in dealing with those problems. In other words, there is such a thing as natural law, a canon, a body of principles, a law that regulate the universe. And if we think that we can ignore that, us being the created, not the creator, I think we're sadly deluded, and the consequences of such a dereliction of responsibility are going to be very, very serious, if not possibly the end of civilization, maybe. So we have to, I think we have to learn that there's a spiritual and a physical aspect to life. And if you're going to destroy the spiritual, you're going to destroy the basis upon which we operate in the physical realm. If you destroy the physical aspect of life, you don't have time for the spiritual aspect. They're two things, and they have to be organically, realistically integrated. And so I think that it's really absolutely, I mean, these banks, I mean, what right? Do they produce anything of real value? Are they not just accountants? Then why do they, how do they ever manage to obtain a claim or a mortgage upon the real assets of the community, which actually produces the real wealth? Banks create no real wealth. I guess I have to admit that they do provide a service, an accountancy service, but I don't think the accountancy department has a right to go to the board of managers and say, okay, we're taking over now, we own the business. That's what's happening.
Very good observation, Wally. That's exactly right. Closing comments, Robert.
Well, there is accountancy by the banking system, but it's corrupt accountancy, and it's a system that they have intentionally developed in order to enslave the world. So we've fallen prey to this because we haven't examined the principles upon which they're operating. And if we don't soon, there is no hope for the world, one would think, because this fantastic lien, this, I don't know, $250 trillion lien against the future initiative of society.
That's right.
You know, before we can do what we want to do constructively, we're going to have to pay off this incredible debt. And it's just going to paralyze society.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Robert. I've really enjoyed today. I think we've covered some very, very good ground. And the fact is, the question put before us was conservatism. Answer or problem? Is it the answer or is it the problem? And I think we've presented a compelling case for our audience today, and I look forward to future discussions at the Freedom Forum from our guests from Canada, Wally Klinck.
Thank you, Arnie. Always good to be with you.
And Robert Klinck.
Thanks, Arnie.
No
I'm happy to do this with you. Very good.
Beautiful. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.